Hey, welcome back to Through a TCK's Eyes. Last time, we looked at culture and worldview, and how societies and cultures are built around the three archetypes of worldview. To see that video, click the card above or the link in the description below. Now, bear in mind that worldview is not the only way to examine the differences in cultures and people groups. There are other ways, like monochronic versus polychronic, individualistic versus tribalistic, direct versus indirect. I plan to do some videos on these at a later date, but let's stick to one theme at a time. As I said in the first video, cultures are extremely nuanced and complex issues. So, at the risk of being a bit simplistic about things, I tried to simplify stuff enough to be understandable. Keep in mind that while I'm talking about people groups and countries at the moment, you can subdivide these groups to the point where, as an individual, different parts of you are functioning from different worldviews. And the way we did that is we looked at the analogy of lights. With just 3 different color lights, red, green, and blue, we can make all the colors that we are used to seeing. This is how computers and TV screens work. If you want an in-depth look at that, Technology Connections has a great video on the subject. I'll leave the link in the description. Worldview is very similar, with the 3 archetypes of power-fear, guilt-innocence, and honor-shame. When we looked at worldview, we saw the effects it has on different aspects of life. And the 5 key parts of life that I mentioned were social, economic, judicial, political, and religious. The reason I chose those categories is I felt that most aspects of life can be slotted into those categories. While exploring the concept of worldview, I defined a lot of the parameters, but I didn't go anywhere with it. I left you with a bit of a cliffhanger. I didn't talk about how this works in real life. Now I want to look at the practical expression of worldview. One of my favorite things is literature. I'm going to broaden the category of literature beyond its dictionary definition of written works, to include everything produced on all the new mediums we have today. Since they either have scripts or transcripts, is it really that big of a stretch? If somebody has a better word for this, please let me know in the comments. One of my favorite categories in literature is fiction. Fiction has many different subcategories: science fiction, fantasy, etc. The cool thing about fiction is that it is a space where we can explore societal, cultural, political, and worldview topics without really offending too many people too much. Because it's fiction, you're not saying that any particular person did anything wrong. They're just fantasy characters. But for suspension of disbelief, fiction has to be grounded in reality. Where are we going with this, you might ask? Well, I've been watching Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine recently, and I've noticed that the 3 archetypes of power-fear, honor-shame, and guilt-innocence can be seen quite distinctly in the TV shows. Before we go any further, I want to say I'm not here to say that any worldview is good or bad, or better or worse than any other. I'm just here to describe them and help you examine the way the world works. Carrying on, anyone who knows the shows is familiar with the Klingons. Big, bold, brash, and kind of uncouth. But if you get past all of that, you can see that they are an honor-shame culture. Everything they do is focused on gaining honor and avoiding dishonor or shame. If we look at how they function, they lie, they cheat, they manipulate, but nobody gets that mad until somebody gets caught. Does this make them a good or bad culture? Who are we to judge? Looking closer at the Klingons, One of my favorite characters is Worf. He's a real stand-up guy. You couldn't ask for a better friend or more loyal companion, and yet everything he does is about gaining honor and avoiding shame. If we look at him from a guilt-innocence standard, he is moral. Some other Klingons are immoral. Now, if we were to look from the perspective of the power-fear paradigm, Worf, having a healthy sense of identity, doesn't feel threatened by those around him, freeing him to engage with people from a place of love. Mind you, he is a bit socially awkward, inspiring awe in his subordinates, his peers, and his superiors. Unlike most of us, Worf is not driven by ambition. So, despite being someone who is very powerful, he doesn't seek out more power. So, from a power-fear point of view, he is a failure. Not because he doesn't have power, but because he refuses to use it to gain more power. Alternatively, we have Duras, who tries to steal the Klingon Empire. All his power is terror-based. He causes fear in people to gain political power in the Klingon Empire. So, you can be powerful, either with love and or violence, or you can have either fear in awe and or terror. Depending on which of the three worldviews you judge the Klingons from, you come up with different sets of who the good guys and the bad guys are. Regardless of how we choose to view them, the Klingon view themselves through honor and shame. We tend to judge based on our worldview, but from their standpoint of honor-shame, all that matters in the end is, this guy has honor, and that guy does not. Okay, moving on. The Romulans and the Cardassians are both power-fear cultures, meaning that everything they do is focused on gaining more power and instilling fear in others, or removing their own fear. Once again, I'm not judging them or the culture as good or bad, or better or worse than any other. We are just examining and describing what it is. If we look at this from the guilt-innocence framework, there are good Romulans and good Cardassians, which are loving parents and caring citizens, and bad Romulans and bad Cardassians, those that are uncaring people, doing whatever they want and making choices that hurt those around them, all to gain power. If we look from the honor-shame perspective, we can see that there are honorable Romulans and Cardassians, people concerned with the community as a whole, and the image of their culture. There are also those who have no honor, making promises they never intend to keep, and betraying the people closest to them. However, as a power-fear culture, they aren't concerned with honor and shame, or guilt and innocence, which might, from those two worldviews, seem evil. Whereas the reality is, they are just different. The only appropriate judgment comes from inside the same worldview it is judging. Consequently, we can save our outsider's judgment for later. Because from inside the Cardassian and Romulan empires, these choices that they make are viewed as the better choice, because it gives them power. Nobody will dispute the choice that they made, because it was acceptable by their culture and their worldview, regardless of the outcome. Finally, we come to the third archetype, guilt-innocence. Here we have Starfleet. And you might be inclined to say, wait, what about the Federation as a whole, or specifically the Vulcans? To which I say, the Federation has many different cultures, with different worldviews, and the Vulcans are a power-fear culture, like their very distant relatives, the Romulans. Okay, back to Starfleet. As an organization, they have deference to Starfleet directives and general orders, their objective set of rules. Starfleet officers function by a higher code. Everything is always measured against these directives. Rules of conduct, if you will. There are honorable Starfleet officers, like Picard, who would never betray or subvert his friends or fellow officers. And there are dishonorable Starfleet officers. Admiral Nechayev fits into this category. She hasn't done anything illegal or immoral, but she has little regard for what people think of her. Consequently, she makes choices most people wouldn't feel comfortable with. Looking from a power-fear standpoint, Starfleet officers, particularly a lot of the admirals seen in the show, like Admiral Owen Paris, are very powerful. Contrasting Admiral Paris with Captain Janeway, both are very powerful and don't play around, expecting compliance simply because they are in charge. However, without doing anything illegal or immoral, Paris, from what we see of him, does this mostly by inspiring varying levels of terror in his subordinates. Conversely, Janeway inspires awe in her crew. They do as they are told, partly because they must, but mostly they do it because Janeway would give her life for them. And then we have Reg, Lieutenant Reginald Barclay, the most fear-filled officer on screen. For most of his screen time, he is either in terror or in awe of someone, even though he is always trying to do the right thing. Now, you have probably noticed that almost all of the Starfleet characters are good guys from a guilt-innocence worldview. And that's no accident, as the writers of the show and the target audience come from a guilt-innocence worldview themselves. However, if we were to judge the guilt-innocence worldview based on the other two worldviews, we could come to different conclusions on who the heroes and the villains are. But the reality is, the only metric that is truly relevant is their own metric. Starfleet officers in the guilt-innocence worldview are all judged by the guilt-innocence worldview, and not by honor-shame or power-fear. Having given some examples of what the three archetypes can look like in a functioning society... Wait! Isn't this all fiction? Yes, I know that everything I talked about is fictional. But if fiction doesn't match our experiences of reality, then we find it hard to enjoy, as it often doesn't feel believable. Now, I would like to challenge you to try and map the subgroups within your culture and see if you can identify which worldview they are functioning out of. Thank you for taking the time to learn about worldviews with me. I think one of the best investments we can make is learning about ourselves and the world we live in. If you are interested in topics like this and want to learn more, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notifications. Also, I'm now on Patreon and Facebook, where you can get involved in the conversation, so go check out those links in the description below. Next time, on Through a TCK's Eyes, we are going for a bumpy ride, as we examine some controversial topics to see how worldview can get in the way of good communication. See you then.